Hello. There are a number of talking points I want to bring into this video, so please bear with me. The latest development on the Extinction Rebellion protests is that the Metropolitan Police have issued a city-wide, or at least covering their jurisdiction, city police, I don't know what measures they've taken, ban on Extinction Rebellion protests. The ban hasn't been entirely effective insofar as protests have went ahead, the direct action tactics have went ahead. The Extinction Rebellion side are claiming that it's unlawful. Some of them are lawyers, and they're saying that it's an unlawful act. I suspect many Londoners will support the Metropolitan Police in this action. One of their founders, Gail Braybrook, was actually on the facade of the transport building, and she was hammering, I don't know whether it was posters or something, to the glass panels on the top of the rotating doors. I saw a video earlier in which the police were talking about the sort of countermeasures they were using to take on those enlightened sages who are gluing their hands to public buildings. Of all the tactics they've taken part in, that might be one of the most stupid, in my opinion, because not only are they injuring themselves, right? Obviously, if it's a super strength of glue, that's going to, cause them physical damage when they come off. It's wasting resources. They'll have to be brought to hospital. That takes up the time of medical staff because of their own stupidity. Talk about self-induced injuries. It also takes up police resources. And all of that, of course, means more emergency vehicles going out, more resources being used, more CO2. Just like when they, block off traffic, what does that do? It causes gridlock, which causes CO2 to build up. More CO2 than there would otherwise be. So, anyway, I've been pretty blunt about what I think of Extinction Rebellion, and I'll talk more about that, but I want to be a bit broader here. I want to talk about limits, responsibilities and freedoms in a civic democratic society and what we understand by that. And I want to kind of amalgamate this, or correlate it, or compare it to the situation in Hong Kong, because what I'm starting to see is some of those who are very much on the side of Beijing in the Hong Kong situation are pointing to Britain and pointing to movements like Extinction Rebellion and sarcastically saying, oh, maybe you should copy the Chinese example, or maybe you can send them to Hong Kong, etc, etc. The implication being is that the British support the Hong Kong protesters but don't like protests on their own backyard. The reality, of course, is not that simple. Firstly, the overwhelming number of demonstrators in Hong Kong have been peaceful. Earlier in the year, there was a massive demonstration. Estimates is up to 2 million people. And even if that's an exaggeration, even if you consider that's exaggerated, irrefutably it was a massive demonstration, at least hundreds of thousands. In a city of 7 million, so a very big proportion of Hong Kongers took part. It was overwhelmingly peaceful. Chinese state media ignored it. Only now are they reporting it. Look at China Daily, look at other Chinese state sources. They're only now reporting it because there is trouble. And I feel it is a great pity that there is a minority of demonstrators who are committing violence. I'd like to get into conspiracy theories and say it's probably, or it might be the Chinese state that's kind of instigated them to make the movement look bad. But I have to be honest, probably it is a hardcore group of protesters. And I'm frustrated by that because I think it damages the image of the movement. And there are things going on that cannot be condoned. A protester stabbed a police officer the other day. You could see it in the footage. There's no justification for that. It's wrong. It's thuggery, right? And just because the police have engaged in excess doesn't excuse protesters doing so. They are changing the dynamic of this demonstration as being about democracy, and all they're doing is playing into Beijing's hands. So they're damaging the movement. That's why I'm frustrated at them. And also, they're imposing on other Hong Kongers who maybe support the ideals but not these methods. But any big movement, you're going to get that radical faction. Where this differs from Extinction Rebellion is the whole of Extinction Rebellion is a radical faction. It's not like one faction is kind of peacefully demonstrating and the others are going for, chaining themselves to buildings and gluing themselves to buildings. They all do it. And recently it emerged that they're being paid expenses. I'd like to see where that funding comes from. I hope the movement collapses on itself. I have no time for Extinction Rebellion. I do not share the idea that they are heroes who are, visionaries seeing the future. And I also think comparisons with suffragettes and the civil rights demonstrators of the past is problematic. The suffragettes were divided in their movement, and there is no evidence to suggest that the more extreme suffragettes, those who use pretty much terrorist tactics, planting bombs and so on, there's no evidence that that particular method was what got women the vote. In fact, all it done was harden resolves at the time. It was a long, hard-fought campaign, and women did sacrifice a lot, but the idea that the direct action tactics is what eventually that led to the bill being passed in Parliament, I think is deeply flawed. I think there was, it was just a lot of hard work rather than tactics that polarised the public. The same with the civil rights movement. Yes, the civil rights marchers commit civil disobedience by sitting into segregated diners, for example. They probably pissed off a lot of segregationists, but they never engaged in vandalism. They never glued themselves to buildings. So the dynamic of the protest was different. But on the wider issue of what is at stake here in terms of democracy and freedom and so on, I've never said that Extinction Rebellion do not have a right to protest. And I don't think it's inconsistent to support the demonstrations in Hong Kong and the ideals behind them, whilst not being fully in favour of Extinction Rebellion. Well, I'm not in favour of them, I won't beat around the bush, I'm not. But I do believe climate change is a real issue, and I believe that the Hong Kong demonstrators have legitimate grievances. But I do think there's a difference in, like I said, the dynamics, in that the bulk of Hong Kong demonstrators were peaceful. Now you have a hardcore element that are engaging in stupid violence. With Extinction Rebellion, the whole movement believes in direct action. I won't be surprised though if there is some splits emerge in terms of, not in terms necessarily of the tactics, but for example in funding, like low level members, well, they're getting these expenses. At some point, a lot of these people actually, contrary to what the right wing critics say, they're not all unemployed. A lot of them are actually in jobs, and they can't conceive that they keep getting arrested and spending time off work to pitching off work to engage in these demonstrations. So at some point they're maybe going to get tired of it and think, are we actually achieving anything here? The more sensible ones, if there are any, might actually start questioning that as an approach. And then you get someone as arrogant as Roger Hallam, who believes who basically has a god complex. Just look at his interviews, he genuinely thinks he has all the answers. So I can see a split emerging in Extinction Rebellion, and I hope it does, and I hope the movement collapses in on itself. The police, incidentally, have been incredibly restrained. There was an elderly protester the other day, I believe he was 83, and he was actually boasting of being arrested numerous times, and he was encouraging the young demonstrators to do likewise, and he said he was doing it for his grandchildren. Well, the narrative that Extinction Rebellion's going to spin. Oh, look at the brutal police arresting this old man. Well, being 83 doesn't mean that you're completely insensible or you're helpless. He's a grown man who knows what he's doing, and one could easily argue that, he's had 83 years to grow up. it's kind of the manipulative narrative that they put out for Greta Thunberg on the other side of the spectrum. Oh, don't criticise an old man. Oh, how brave of him. No, he's a grown man. He's had 83 years to see that these sort of tactics don't work. So, the police are right to arrest him. Being old doesn't mean you're above the law. And, they should do it gently. And by all accounts they did. But, he shouldn't be sort of, and I'm not saying he is, but some of his supporters might say, oh, how dare they arrest an old man? No. He's... You can't use that as a way to say, oh, I cannot be arrested because of my age. If you commit vandalism or, you disrupt the public, you have to be held to account. And this is where I want to talk about responsibility. Because in both movements in Hong Kong and in Extinction Rebellion, responsibility is a key factor. I do believe sincerely that one of the hallmarks of a free democratic society is the right to dissent, something that just isn't allowed in mainland China, something that is allowed in Hong Kong. It has taken an ugly turn, in part because of the stubbornness of Carrie Lam to really listen to very reasonable aspirations and demands of the movement. So I do think her leadership has been a big part of the problem. Having said that, if protesters are engaging in wanton vandalism, they are responsible for their own actions. And in my view, they're responsible for damaging the image of the movement. Communist media is always going to be biased, is always going to be pro-China. But they can still control their own actions. Extinction Rebellion seem to think that they can simply go on doing this with no end in sight. They're above the law. And of course they're talking about, oh, it's totalitarian, this ban. Well, the police have tolerated this for a long time, so has the wider public. And I think a lot of people will support the police. They'll say, about time. You cannot have a situation where a minority in Hong Kong or in Britain disrupt the majority and say, we know best. And this is what Extinction Rebellion just don't get. Their go-to always is, but the environment, but climate change, but it's for the future, but that's the bigger issue. Whether it is or isn't is actually beside the point in terms of how they're delivering the message. Because no movement in history, no matter how worthy or noble, has ever got to success without widespread support. Extinction Rebellion do not have widespread support. They just don't. So that needs to be understood, because we have the dictatorship of authoritarian regimes, single party states, absolute monarchies, communism, fascism, Islamism. You have theocracies. But then there is democracies where it is generally understood the right to peaceful protest is a given. But when we say peaceful protest, peaceful also means not disrupting the public. That needs to be understood. And Extinction Rebellion have the arrogant notion they could do what they want. So I really believe that I can hear my phone ringing, but I want to finish this video. I really believe that people need to... It's distracting. I do want to finish this video though. Told my friend not to do this. Anyway, responsibility. With democratic freedoms does come responsibility. And you cannot disrupt the public with no end in sight with the argument, I know best, and not expect consequences. I mean, do they really think the police are just going to stand by and watch them? Do they really think the wider public should just see the light and get on board with what they're doing? No. And the same applies to Hong Kong. Those violent protesters, I mean, the violence that's happening in Hong Kong is but a flicker compared to 70 years of communist oppression and mass murder. But still wrong, and it will still damage the movement. So with democracy comes responsibility. This needs to be understood.